They mocked his accent, questioned his ID, and called security. No one knew he owned the building they were standing in before we dive in. Let us know where you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. It was a quiet Tuesday morning at the downtown branch of Concordia Bank. The kind of quiet that came with marble floors, fluorescent lights, and the soft clicking of keyboards. The kind of quiet that made you hear every sigh, every whisper, every judgmental glance. At precisely 9:22 a.m., a man stepped to the glass doors wearing a faded gray hoodie, loose jeans, and a well-worn baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. His boots were dusty, his posture relaxed, but there was something about him that made people look twice, then dismiss him just as quickly. Too old, too plain, too foreign. He carried no designer briefcase, no monogram leather wallet, just a folded piece of paper and a state-issued ID tucked into a plastic card sleeve. The receptionist barely looked up when he approached the desk. Her tone was automatic, distant. "What's your business today?" "I'd like to make a withdrawal," he said, his voice low and marked by a thick Austrian accent. It was steady, polite, and unmistakably foreign. That was enough. Her eyes flicked up, narrowed slightly. "Cash?" she asked. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. He nodded. "Yes. I believe I already filled out the form. Just need it processed." She took the slip and scanned the amount. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. $80,000. She didn't hide the skepticism in her voice. "Wait here." As the man took a seat near the windows, whispers began before the first teller even confirmed his request. "Did you see that old guy?" one staff member muttered. 80 grand? He doesn't look like he's ever seen $80. A chuckle. Maybe he thinks he's still in the 80s. "I bet he's here to pull some wire fraud trick." Another offered, loud enough for the adjacent cubicle to hear. "That accent? Please. Eastern Europe or something. Classic." The man sat in silence, unaware or perhaps too used to the stares to care. The sunlight cast shadows across the polished floor, and the waiting room buzzed faintly with the sound of printers and passive aggression. One customer, a woman in her 30s wearing a designer trench coat, clutched her purse a little closer as she passed him. A young man at the ATM turned to glance and rolled his eyes. At the service counter, teller number 4, her name tag read Amanda. Typed something, frowned, then called for assistance. A taller man with a buzz cut and a permanent scowl leaned over her shoulder. He whispered something, then looked up at the customer still seated near the windows. "That's the guy." Amanda nodded. He scoffed. "Let's see what story he's selling." The man was called to the counter after waiting 20 minutes. Not long by most standards, but long enough for the room to know he wasn't welcome. He approached calmly, placing his withdrawal slip, ID, and bank card on the desk. Amanda didn't smile. She looked at the ID, then back at him. She squinted. "This ID, it's a little worn," she said, turning it in her hands like she expected it to change shape. "It's valid," the man replied gently. She typed something again. "You're requesting a cash withdrawal of $80,000, she repeated, louder than necessary. "Yes," he said. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. "Do you mind telling me what it's for?" The man tilted his head slightly. "I don't believe that's required. It's my account." Amanda glanced to her left. The man with the buzz cut, his name was Jeff, stepped closer. "Sir," Jeff said, folding his arms, "with that amount, we need to verify the origin of the funds." The man didn't flinch. "The origin is Concordia Bank. I earned it. I deposited it. I'm withdrawing it." Jeff smirked. "We're seeing a lot of scams lately. Fake accounts. Fraud. People pretending to be who they're not. We can't just hand out cash to anyone who walks in." Behind them, another teller, a younger man with gelled hair, leaned in and whispered to his colleague. Too loud to be subtle. Maybe he won the lottery. Or maybe he's laundering money for the old country. Amanda let out a short laugh before catching herself. Jeff didn't even try. "Look, we'll need a second ID. Something with a signature. And maybe a utility bill. You know, proof you live where you say you do." The man said nothing for a moment. Then he reached into his wallet, pulled out a second form of identification, and set it gently on the counter. He didn't argue. didn't raise his voice, didn't play into the caricature they wanted him to be. Instead, he simply said, "You have all you need to process the withdrawal. I'd like to proceed." Amanda took the ID, stared at it, then passed it back with a sigh. "We'll have to ask the branch manager," she said. Jeff added, "Security's going to want a word too. Protocol, you understand." At that, the branch manager arrived. Jessica Keller. Pencil skirt, pristine blouse, and a smile like glass. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't ask the man's name. She simply looked at him the way someone looks at gum on a shoe. "Sir," she said, her voice all syrup and superiority, "I understand you're attempting a rather large cash transaction." "I'm making a withdrawal," he replied. "From my account." Jessica leaned in slightly, her tone sharpening. "This branch serves high-value clients, people with reputations. Background we can verify. We are not a check-cashing center." She turned to Amanda and Jeff. "If he insists, get security. Escort him out. We don't have time to entertain these situations." Behind them, a man in a suit was being greeted by name, handed coffee, and ushered into a private room. A Hispanic woman waited at the line with her toddler, unnoticed. The man at the counter said nothing, just stood there, hands by his sides, breathing slowly. Jessica leaned closer, her perfume heavy, her words deliberate. "We reserve the right to refuse service, especially when something feels off." The man finally looked up, straight into her eyes. "You just made the most expensive mistake of your career," he said calmly. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, not to call security, but someone far, far higher. None of them noticed. Not yet. 35 years earlier, in a one-bedroom apartment on the edge of Santa Monica, a young immigrant stood in front of a mirror practicing English with a tape recorder. The words were clumsy in his mouth, heavy with accent, but he repeated them anyway, over and over. "Excuse me, I'd like to open an account. I have my ID. Thank you for your service." He didn't need them for an exam. He needed them for survival. Because no matter how many trophies he'd won, or how many nights he'd slept on gym floors just to save money, people still looked at him and saw a body, not a brain. That man was Arnold Schwarzenegger. And he remembered that feeling of being seen as muscle, not mind, better than most. When he first arrived in America, Arnold had nothing but a gym bag, a German English dictionary, and a dream so outlandish it made even his friends laugh. He worked construction by day, trained by night, and cleaned equipment at a downtown fitness club during graveyard shifts. The first time he went into a bank, the teller ignored him for 10 minutes, helping customers who arrived after him. When he finally reached the counter and tried to open a checking account with the cash in his pocket, she said, "That's not how we do things here." No smile, no welcome, just the kind of tone people say for someone they've already decided doesn't belong. But Arnold didn't walk away. He came back the next day, and the next. Eventually, someone noticed his persistence. An assistant manager helped him fill out the forms, explain how accounts worked, and even waive the initial balance requirement. Arnold never forgot that man's name. It wasn't the kindness that stuck, it was how rare it was. From that moment, Arnold decided success wouldn't just be about wealth or fame. It would be about walking into the rooms that once tried to keep him out, and one day, owning them. Over the next 3 decades, he did just that. He conquered bodybuilding. He turned a heavy accent into Hollywood gold. He became a citizen, then a governor. And when the 2008 financial crisis hit, while other celebrities were buying ranches and sports cars, Arnold made a different kind of move. He quietly invested in the infrastructure of institutions he once couldn't access. Banks, credit unions, startups founded by immigrants and veterans. Concordia Bank had been one of those. The board had nearly folded under bad debt and public distrust. But Arnold saw potential, not in their numbers, but in their mission. Community first. They said, equity, not privilege. He wrote the check that saved their flagship operations, then asked for no PR, no statue, no building in his name, just accountability, a seat at the table, and access to the full picture whenever he asked for it. What no one in that downtown branch knew, not Amanda, not Jeff, not even Jessica Keller, was that the man they mocked was not just a client. He was their quiet protector, their highest level equity investor, and more importantly, the one who had personally pushed for a system of anonymous audits after noticing patterns in service complaints. Customers of color, immigrants, and seniors reporting cold treatment, unexplained delays, or denied transactions, almost always with vague notes like incomplete documentation or account flagged. Yet, when reviewed, the paperwork was complete. The flags? Arbitrary. Arnold didn't believe in boardroom reports alone. He believed in walking the ground, seeing it, feeling it. So 3 weeks ago, he informed the board he would begin a quiet review of select branches under a code name known only to the Director of Oversight. He'd visit without notice, without security, and without fanfare. No cameras, no introductions. If the bank was what they claimed it to be, it would treat a quiet old man with the same dignity as a celebrity investor. But today, that theory had been tested. And the result? Mocked, disrespected, profiled. He hadn't expected fanfare. But he hadn't expected this level of contempt either. From the moment he walked in, he'd noticed it. The way Amanda's smile dimmed when she heard his accent. The way Jeff stepped in like a security guard in a nightclub, as if blocking a threat. The word fraud and suspicious tossed around casually, like reflexes. Jessica hadn't even tried to mask her disgust. She looked at him the way someone might look at an uninvited guest at a gala, tolerated for a moment, then removed. Arnold could feel the same look he once received in the 70s, when people saw a foreigner and assumed ignorance. But this time, the stakes weren't his pride. They were systemic, because if this is how they treated him, an older white man with confidence and a perfect account record. How were they treating the people without a camera in their collar? How many others had walked away from that very counter, too ashamed to argue, too tired to prove they belonged? That was the question that made his jaw tighten. That was the reason he had come. And that was why, despite the humiliation, he stayed calm. Despite the comments, the side glances, the insinuations, he didn't raise his voice. Not yet, because this wasn't about a scene. It was about the system. About showing the board, not with spreadsheets or slogans, but with cold, painful evidence, how far they had drifted from their own values. At the far end of the lobby, a security guard had started moving toward the desk. Jeff had made the call. Arnold was sure of it. Jessica crossed her arms with visible satisfaction. Amanda avoided eye contact. The customers who had gathered to watch, some curious, others uncomfortable, leaned in just slightly. Arnold checked the time. For minutes. That's how long it had taken them to decide he wasn't worth serving. That's how long it had taken him to decide their fate was sealed. He reached for his phone, not to call for help, but to open a direct line to the only person who had the authority to make the next move, the chairman of Concordia's board. But he didn't dial just yet. Let them say one more thing. Let them cross one more line. Because once he made that call, nothing about this branch, or the people running it, would ever be the same again. Security will be here shortly, Jeff said with a smug grin, not even trying to hide the satisfaction in his voice. Amanda looked down at her screen, pretending to be absorbed in data she wasn't reading. Jessica stood with her arms folded, tapping one manicured finger against the side of her blouse, as if she were timing how long it would take to get rid of the problem in front of her. The problem, of course, being the man who hadn't raised his voice once, who hadn't insulted anyone, who had followed every rule, presented every document, and waited more patiently than any of the customers behind him. But in their eyes, he had committed a different kind of offense. He didn't look like someone they wanted in their bank. Arnold glanced to the left. A young woman, Latina, mid-20s, had been standing in line for over 15 minutes. She'd arrived before two white customers, both of whom had already been served. The woman's face was tired, but her posture was proud. Her hands clutched a manila folder, probably documents for a loan or small business account. No one had even said hello. Behind her, a black man with a gray goatee waited quietly. Postal worker uniform, hand behind his back, eyes on the floor. He hadn't moved in 10 minutes, and no teller had acknowledged his presence. Not once. This wasn't just about him. It never had been. This was a pattern. And it wasn't new. Arnold had seen it in the data, buried in quarterly reports and filtered surveys. But no spreadsheet could replicate what was happening in this lobby. The silence, the glances, the way customers of color were treated like burdens instead of clients. This wasn't customer service. This was coded hostility, draped in policy, wrapped in plausible deniability. Sir, Amanda said, suddenly remembering performed concern. If you don't have another form of ID, we'll need to. I provided two, Arnold replied evenly. Both valid, both verified. Jeff cut in. They look real, but we can't be too careful these days. His words echoed in the air, loud enough for the customers behind Arnold to hear. The young Latina woman shifted uncomfortably. The postal worker exhaled through his nose. Jessica stepped forward again, arms still crossed. This isn't personal, she said, her voice cool and clipped. It's just policy. Large withdrawals require escalation, especially when circumstances don't line up. What circumstances? Arnold asked. Jessica hesitated for only a moment, then smiled. Let's just say we had people come in claiming to be someone they're not, especially older men. It happens. Amanda let out a soft laugh, barely stifled. Jeff grinned wider. Maybe you just got lucky, he added. Inheritance lottery, we've seen it all. One day someone shows up with a name they barely pronounce and thinks we'll just hand over 80,000 in cash. That was the line. Arnold didn't flinch, but something behind his eyes went quiet. Jeff, sensing that he'd scored a hit, leaned on the counter like he owned it. You understand, right? We've got to protect the bank from people who don't belong in certain financial circles. That's not racism. That's responsibility. A customer near the ATM turned slightly, pretending to look away, but clearly listening. The Latina woman's eyes were now fixed on Arnold. The postal worker looked up. Finally, Jessica adjusted her blazer. This doesn't have to be a scene. If you just lower your request, say, a few thousand, I'm sure we can make something work. Arnold let the words hang. He looked past Jessica to the security guard, now stepping into the lobby. Young, early 20s, nervous, his badge crooked, his shirt tucked too tightly into his belt. This wasn't a man ready for confrontation. This was someone who'd been called out of the break room and handed a problem no one had trained him for. Jessica turned to him. Escort this gentleman out, please. He's refusing to cooperate. The guard hesitated. Do you mean call the police or? No, Jessica snapped. Just remove him. Now. Arnold took one slow step back, not out of fear, but to allow the guard a moment to choose who he wanted to be. I have complied with every request, Arnold said, voice still calm. I've waited. I've answered your questions. I've offered valid ID. I withdrawn this amount before. I have not raised my voice, insulted anyone, or broken any rules. So what exactly is the reason for this refusal? Jessica opened her mouth, but no words came out, because the reason, if spoken aloud, would expose everything. Jeff stepped in again. It's a vibe, all right? You're just off. Amanda flinched. A customer behind them gasped. That was it. The slip, the mask fell. And for the first time, Arnold looked at each of them. Jeff, Jessica, Amanda, not with frustration, but with pity, because they had no idea what was coming. He slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The security guard instinctively reached for his radio. It's just a call, Arnold said gently, to someone who knows exactly who I am. Jessica scoffed. Please, who are you going to call? The consulate. Jeff laughed out loud. But Amanda had gone pale, because as Arnold tapped the screen, she caught a glimpse of the contact name lighting up. Concordia Boardroom. The call rang once, then twice. Hello, a voice answered. Mr. Prescott, Arnold said evenly. This is our moment. The pause on the other end was sharp. Immediate recognition. Yes, sir, the voice replied. Understood. Arnold hung up without another word. Jessica blinked. Jeff's grin faltered. Amanda stepped back from the counter. The security guard shifted uneasily. No one knew what had just happened, but every person in the lobby felt it. The temperature shifted. The air got heavier. And the quiet man in the gray hoodie, whose name none of them had bothered to ask, just became the most important person in the building. The silence that followed the end of that phone call was unlike anything the branch had experienced. Not the hushed stillness of banking transactions or the lull between customer greetings, but a silence filled with dread, the kind that made people stop mid-sentence, the kind that made even the clock seem to tick louder. Jessica stood stiff, blinking slowly as if replaying the last 10 seconds in her mind, trying to convince herself it didn't mean what it clearly meant. Amanda's knuckles went white as she gripped the edge of the counter. Jeff no longer leaned with confidence. His arms dropped to his sides. The laughter that had just filled the space dried up instantly, replaced by a tension thick enough to press against the walls. The young security guard, still holding his radio, looked from Arnold to Jessica, then back again. His face was blank with confusion. His feet stuck where he stood, waiting for someone, anyone, to tell him what to do. Mr. Prescott? Amanda whispered, more to herself than anyone else. It was a name they all knew, but only from emails and monthly memos. The chairman of the board, a name no customer would ever say out loud unless they actually knew him, unless they had his number, unless they had a reason to call. Jessica snapped her fingers. Back to your stations, she said sharply, forcing composure into her voice like glue trying to hold a crumbling sculpture. There's no need for drama. But no one moved. Across the lobby, the older postal worker took a step forward. He didn't speak, but his face said it all. For the first time in the last 20 minutes, he wasn't looking down. He was watching closely. The Latina woman still stood in line, but now she had her phone in her hand, not to text or scroll, but recording, quietly, just in case. The double doors at the front of the branch suddenly opened. Not wide, not dramatically, but with purpose. 3 men in suits stepped inside. All of them wore security credentials clipped to their belts, but not the kind that came from mall patrol or third-party contractors. These were corporate security officers, internal investigators, the type deployed only when something serious had already happened. They moved swiftly but without panic, scanning the room. One of them nodded toward Arnold, then spoke quietly into a small headset. Another disappeared down the hallway that led to the manager's office. Jessica's face froze. What is going on? She demanded. Why are they here? No one answered her. Not because they didn't want to, because they didn't need to. A minute later, the lobby lights flickered. Just once. Then came the unmistakable sound of the main security system unlocking. Double glass doors open again, and this time, a woman in a navy blue power suit walked in with such precision that the air seemed to part before her. Diane Weiss, Chief Operating Officer, Concordia Bank, second only to the chairman. She had not been in the city that morning. She was supposed to be in Denver for a strategy summit, but that call changed everything. She strode forward without glancing left or right. Her eyes locked on Arnold first. Her pace slowed just slightly, then steadied as she reached him. Sir, she said, her voice low but resolute. Are you all right? Arnold gave the smallest nod. For now. Diane turned. Her eyes swept the room, then settled on Jessica. The smile Jessica had been rehearsing vanished before it made it to her lips. Ms. Keller, Diane said, tone clipped but clear. May I speak with you? Now. Jessica took one uncertain step forward. Of course. But if you could just tell me. I prefer not to say in front of your staff. Diane cut in, but you'll understand shortly. The 3 corporate investigators followed. One lingered near Amanda's desk, unobtrusively checking the terminal activity log. Another tapped his tablet, syncing to the branch's security feed. They weren't reacting. They were documenting. Jeff looked like he wanted to disappear. Amanda tried to look busy. The security guard slowly backed away toward the front desk, clearly trying not to breathe too loud. Diane and Jessica disappeared into the office behind a teller row, the door shutting with a heavy finality. The rest of the staff stood paralyzed. Arnold remained where he was, calm and composed, saying nothing. Inside the office, muffled voices could be heard, first low, then sharper. The cadence of someone realizing they were not being scolded. They were being investigated. 2 minutes later, the door opened again. Jessica stepped out, pale, Her shoulders, once square with authority, now drooped. Diane followed, holding a sleek black folder in one hand. "This branch is under administrative review effective immediately," she announced, projecting her voice so that every employee and every customer in the lobby could hear. "No further transactions will be processed until instructed. If you are a client, please see our temporary service kiosk across the street or call the hotline printed on the signage at the front. For staff, stay where you are." Her eyes swept back to Arnold. This time, there was no mistaking the recognition or the deference. She took a breath. "For those of you unaware, this man is Mr. Arnold Schwarzenegger, Concordia's principal private investor, a board advisor, and," she paused, locking eyes with Jeff, "the architect of the very equity compliance audit you just failed." Jeff visibly shook. Amanda let out an audible gasp. Jessica closed her eyes. And the rest of the branch realized, in one collective heartbeat, that the man they had tried to escort out was the man who had the power to decide whether they even had a branch to return to tomorrow. The lobby didn't move. Not a breath. Not a whisper. As Diane's words sank in, every person inside the bank seemed to become acutely aware of their own posture, their own silence, their own role in what had just taken place. Some customers had been pretending not to watch, casually scrolling on their phones or rifling through receipts. Now their screens dimmed, heads turned. All eyes were on Arnold, the quiet man they dismissed as a confused elderly customer, the man who now stood as something far more powerful than any of them had imagined. Jessica Keller stood off to the side, her face frozen in a smile that had long since become a mask. But even that mask was cracking. A fine tremor had begun in her left hand. She tried to hide it by adjusting the lapel of her blazer. It didn't work. Diane turned toward her again. "Effective immediately, Jessica, you are relieved of all managerial duties at this branch. Your access credentials are revoked. Legal will contact you before end of day." Jessica opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her face flushed a deep crimson. She was breathing too fast now, lips trembling at the corners. Amanda looked over, wide-eyed, caught somewhere between horror and denial. Jeff took a step back, not toward the counter, but toward the exit. His hand brushed the door handle, until the taller of the two investigators cleared his throat and gave a subtle shake of the head. "Stay," Diane said without even turning. "We're not done." Behind them, one of the corporate officers had connected a portable screen to the wall-mounted television meant for promotional videos. The banking ads disappeared. In their place, a split screen of security footage played. Timestamps, camera angles, audio synced. They'd rewound to the exact moment Arnold stepped into the bank. The first video showed Amanda spotting him, then looking away. A second clip showed the moment Jessica said, "Those people always try to look legitimate. Doesn't mean they are." The third clip had Jeff's voice. "Maybe you won the lottery," he said, laughing. "Or maybe you're just in the wrong place." Each moment played out in full sound, loud enough for the customers in line to hear, loud enough that no one could claim misunderstanding. The room wasn't just watching a reprimand. It was watching a reckoning. In the far corner, the young Latina woman covered her mouth with both hands. The older black man in the postal uniform nodded slowly, his face unreadable but resolute. Another customer, a man in his 30s with a briefcase, shook his head in disbelief and whispered to no one. They had no idea who he was. Diane stood to the side of the screen, hands folded in front of her, letting the footage speak louder than she ever could. Then she turned to the staff. "What happened here today is not an isolated error in judgment," she said. "It is a breach of trust, a violation of the very values this institution claims to uphold. And Mr. Schwarzenegger, who personally helped design our customer dignity protocols, walked into this branch to see if those words on our mission statement meant anything." Her voice sharpened. "And you failed." Amanda finally stepped forward, voice small and shaky. I didn't know. I was just following. You were following bias," Diane replied. "Not policy, not training. Bias." Jeff cleared his throat. "Look, we've had fraud cases before. It's not personal." "Stop," Diane said, raising a hand. The cameras recorded more than enough. You mocked a man's voice, his background, his appearance, and you questioned his right to be here based solely on your assumptions. You laughed at him. You implied he was a criminal. You stood behind someone else's ignorance instead of stepping in. Do you really think a name tag makes that acceptable? Silence. Arnold finally spoke, for the first time since the room had changed. I came here today not for revenge, he said, voice quiet but unmistakably firm, but for truth. I needed to know what the data couldn't tell me. And now I know. He turned to the customers who had waited and watched. If I hadn't been who I am, how many of you would have left today in silence? With no complaint, no scene, just a feeling you weren't welcome? How many times has that happened without anyone noticing? The Latina woman lowered her phone and nodded. The postal worker blinked twice, then wiped his cheek. Whether it was from sweat or something more, no one could tell. Arnold looked back at the staff. This isn't about a bad day. This is about a culture. And I won't let this continue under my watch. Diane stepped forward again. Jessica Keller, Jeff Rowe, Amanda Sterling. Your employment is terminated effective immediately. You'll be escorted by security to collect your personal belongings. Any attempt to delete or alter internal records will be considered a breach of federal compliance and prosecuted accordingly. Jessica staggered. Amanda burst into quiet sobs. Jeff muttered something unintelligible, his eyes darting wildly between the exits. The security team stepped in, not with force, but with finality, as they were guided toward the back office to gather their things. No one clapped. No one cheered. The mood wasn't celebratory. It was solemn, like watching a ship sink after ignoring every warning signal. Diane looked around one last time. To every customer here today, she said, I apologize. What you witnessed is not who we claim to be. But starting now, we are going to be better. Not because of a press release, but because Chain just walked through that door wearing a gray hoodie. And the man in the hoodie? He was already walking toward the exit, without needing to say another word. The sun outside the branch had shifted, casting longer shadows across the pavement as Arnold stepped beyond the glass doors. For a moment he paused, not to look back, but to take in the faces of those still inside. Some pressed against the windows. Others remained frozen at their counters. The same people who had dismissed him, belittled him, and questioned his very right to stand where he stood, now stared in silence. Not just because they had been wrong, but because the story unfolding before them was rewriting something deeper. Their assumptions, their certainty, their place in the system, they thought they understood. Diane followed closely behind, tablet in hand, already tapping in commands. Around her, two senior legal advisors from headquarters approached with folders in hand. None of this was scheduled, none of it rehearsed. But every movement, every step felt orchestrated by something more powerful than protocol, just as long delayed, now catching up in real time. Inside the branch, the aftermath settled like dust. Jessica Keller was no longer standing. She sat in the staff lounge, silent, eyes glazed, her career unraveling moment by moment. Jeff sat with his head in his hands, rocking slightly, still whispering fragments of justification to no one who would listen. Amanda had gone pale, her hands shaking as she tried to log out of her terminal before being gently told to step away. Beth, a junior teller who had remained quiet the entire time, stood by her station, visibly trembling. Unlike the others, she had never spoken a cruel word, but she hadn't stopped any of it either. Her face was filled with a complex mixture of guilt and fear, until Diane paused beside her on her way out. You'll stay, Diane said, barely above a whisper. You saw it. Now help us fix it. Beth nodded through tears. It wasn't absolution. It was responsibility. Meanwhile, across the street in the mobile service kiosk Diane had mentioned earlier, customers were already being assisted. The postal worker who had waited so long that morning was one of the first. This time, the teller greeted him by name, asked how she could help, offered him coffee. None of it was dramatic, but all of it felt different. Back inside headquarters, the response had escalated from urgent to seismic. Video from the branch had already reached key internal teams. By the time Arnold returned to the executive floor, Several board members were waiting, not in their usual conference room chairs, but standing. Prescott, the chairman, was the first to step forward. "We saw everything," he said, voice tight. "You were right. We were blind." Arnold removed the gray hoodie, revealing a crisp black button down beneath. Not flashy, not tailored for intimidation, just clean, sharp, deliberate. He placed the hoodie gently on the table. "This isn't about me," he said quietly. "It's about who they treat like me every day." Diane stepped forward and connected her tablet to main screen. The split screen recordings now included side by side metrics. Footage of Black, Hispanic, and Asian customers waiting to 3 times longer than others. Complaints buried in comment logs. Exit interviews tagged with vague phrases like felt unwelcome or staff unfriendly. But now, each data point had a face, a voice, a timestamp. It was undeniable. "We need to do more than terminate a few bad actors," Diane said. "We need structural accountability, real audits, real consequences." Prescott nodded, slowly, heavily, the burden settling across his shoulders. "And we need to tell the truth," Arnold added, "not a press release. A reckoning." Over the next 48 hours, that reckoning began. An internal memo, crafted not by PR but by Diane and Arnold personally, was distributed to all 900 branches. In it, they described what had occurred with no spin. They included direct quotes, footage, names, not to humiliate, but to educate. A new initiative launched that same day, Project Equitas, a real-time monitoring system that flagged customer interactions based on disparities in service time, tone, and resolution. Every flag interaction would now be reviewed by a team trained in anti-bias policy and community standards. Branch managers would no longer be promoted based solely on financial performance. Equity metrics, such as demographic satisfaction scores, repeat customer loyalty from underserved groups, and complaint resolution time, would now weigh just as heavily. Every teller, security guard, and manager would be required to attend a new training module designed not by a corporate vendor, but in partnership with civil rights organizations and former clients who had experienced discrimination firsthand. Arnold insisted on one more change. His direct line, the same number he had used at the bank, would be printed on every customer feedback form. Not a hotline, not an anonymous box. His number, because, as he said in an internal memo, if we're not ready to hear the worst truths, we're not ready to be trusted with anyone's money. The message landed harder than any public campaign, not because of who said it, but because of what had been seen. Across social media, word spread. The story, once just a branch incident, became a national conversation, not because the CEO had fired 3 people, but because a man disguised as nobody had revealed everybody. By the end of the week, 15 more employees across other branches had quietly resigned, not because they'd been caught, but because they understood they soon would be. Customers began returning, especially those who had once felt invisible, because the face of the institution had changed, not into a celebrity, but into a mirror. And Arnold Schwarzenegger, the man they had once tried to escort out, had just escorted an entire industry toward a new beginning. A month passed, then 2, and the branch that once silenced Arnold with suspicion now displayed his words in gold letters above the entrance. "Dignity is not a luxury. It's the minimum." The building hadn't changed its shape, but everything inside it had been redefined. Staff was new. The training was different. And for the first time, people walked in not expecting to fight for respect, but expecting to be heard. On a warm Monday morning, a young mother entered the branch with her 5-year-old son. She wore a Target brand blouse and carried a slightly torn handbag. Her son clutched a crumpled comic book in one hand and a jar of coins in the other. The moment they stepped up to the counter, the teller smiled, not with corporate politeness, but with real warmth. "Welcome to Concordia. How can I help you today?" There was no pause, no scanning of clothing, no guarded glances. The boy placed a jar on the counter and whispered, "I want to start a savings account." The teller leaned down, eyes level with his. "Then let's start your future today." Behind the desk, Beth, Now the permanent branch manager watched quietly. She didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. Her eyes scanned every interaction, not for mistakes, but for moments of humanity, moments that had once been ignored. She still carried the weight of that day with her, but it no longer crushed her. It guided her. She had earned this position not through ambition, but through awareness, through the humility to admit she had been silent when it mattered, and through the courage to make sure no one else ever had to feel that silence again. In the weeks since the incident, Arnold had returned to the branch, not physically, but his presence was everywhere. His audit team operated under a new name, the Gray Protocol, a nod to the color of the hoodie he had worn that morning. Their work had already impacted 57 locations across 5 states. For regional directors had stepped down, dozens of staff members had undergone corrective training, and the internal compliance team had grown by threefold. Arnold didn't seek credit. He didn't appear on television. He didn't sign interviews. But every employee at Concordia knew this wasn't a campaign. It was a movement. And it had started because someone chose not to yell, not to retaliate, not to storm out, but to stand still and let the truth reveal itself. At headquarters, Diane had launched a series of monthly town halls. Employees were invited, not mandated, to share stories of bias they had witnessed or experienced. Some were hesitant, others were tearful. But as the sessions grew, so did the honesty, and with it, the accountability. In one session, a veteran teller confessed she had once flagged customers for further review based solely on accent. In another, a manager admitted he had coached his team to prioritize profitable looking clients without realizing the coded bias in that directive. No one was punished for what they shared, but everyone was responsible for what they changed afterward. Outside of Concordia, the ripples continued. Articles appeared in national journals. The day the banker got audited by his boss in disguise. Podcasts dissected the footage frame by frame. Civil rights leaders praised the transparency. Competitor banks scrambled to update their training protocols, not because they wanted to, but because they feared what would happen if they didn't. One of the most watched clips online came not from the confrontation, but from the town hall Diane hosted 3 weeks later. In it, she recited Arnold's original memo aloud. If we're not ready to hear the worst truths, we're not ready to be trusted with anyone's money. Her voice cracked slightly on the last line, not from weakness, but from truth. Arnold, sitting in the back of the room, simply nodded. That moment reached over 12 million views in 5 days. In an interview that aired months later, his only public comment on the event, Arnold sat in a quiet room with no stage, no suit, no makeup, just a chair and a single question. What made you go in disguise? He paused for a long moment. Because the system hides behind protocol, he finally said, and sometimes the only way to see clearly is to stop looking like someone the system protects. The interviewer leaned in. Were you angry? He smiled, but there was no humor in it, only clarity. No, I was disappointed, and I think that's worse. Anger burns fast. Disappointment lingers. It makes you rebuild. He stood up before the interview ended, not dramatically, not in defiance, just done. Back at the branch, that young boy returned every week to deposit coins into his new account. The tellers greeted him by name. Beth asked about his school. His mother never had to explain herself, never had to prove she belonged. And on the glass near the exit, a new decal had been applied just days earlier. Customers stopped to read it as they left. It said, "Respect has no minimum balance." And just below that, the quiet signature of the man who had taught them why.